What is up, fight fans? I am Matt from Tales from the Cage, and we have a special edition today. 10 local fights that should have, could have, would have happened, and that just never did here in the Chicagoland and Northwest Indiana MMA mixed martial arts scene. These are either fights that were supposed to happen and got canceled, or they're fights that may never even been discussed, but fights that I personally would have wanted to see, and I felt they would have made sense at that time. Now keep in mind with time frames, we're going to keep this from the late 90s up until roughly 2015 or so. So let's just say these matchups would not really be relevant now, but would have made a lot of sense back then. And now we could say the ship has sailed, but we could still talk about it. Starting off at number 10, Joey Gilbert versus Pedro Vienna. Joey Gilbert is the first four-time state wrestling champion in Illinois history. He had a very successful college career as well, wrestling for the University of Michigan, where he was the Big Ten Freshman of the Year award winner. He took third in the NCAA finals, and he earned All-American status. He took third at ADCC, went as far as to fighting BJ Penn at UFC 31. Pedro Vienna, originally from Brazil, was a jiu-jitsu black belt under Carlson Gracie Jr., along with being a judo black belt. He always showed a wide array of submission knowledge and ability when he fought in both mixed martial arts and in submission grappling. He taught alongside his brother here in Chicago, Daniel Vienna, and had many students in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and a lot of tough training partners in MMA, which catapulted him into dabbling into mixed martial arts from having such a well-versed submission background. Pedro Vienna ended up moving back to Brazil between 2001 and 2004. However, if a fight promoter were to have put this matchup either before 2001 or after 2004, it would have been a great grappling match. Both had only about a handful of fights, roughly 5 or 6, and they were two standout local grappling coaches that really it would have been great. You have a wrestling coach who dabbled in MMA and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach who dabbled in MMA. They had roughly about the same experience in the cage or in the ring, but both very high-level grapplers in their own right, so it would have been great. Unfortunately, in 2019, Pedro Vienna tragically lost his life in a rock climbing accident down in Brazil, but his memory always will reside with us here in the Chicagoland area in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts community. Coming at number 9 on the list, heavyweights, Mark Birch versus Boban Simic. Mark Birch was a standout from Dueling Vale Tudo. He finished off his career with 9 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. And he actually ended up getting signed for a fight against Anthony Hardonk for the UFC. However, he had a blood work issue, had to pull out, and he never fought again. But in the ring and in the cage, he was known to have heavy hands and ready to brawl with just about anybody. Very tough, gritty guy. And that would be like the perfect type of matchup for Boban Simic. Boban Simic, known as a very scary, intimidating fighter who had very heavy hands and could knock out just about anybody he fought. Locally, he fought at XFO, Total Fight Challenge, Combat Dough, and C3. The reason why we wanted to make this fight happen, we wanted to watch this one, was because Mark Birch was somebody that would not just keep shooting and shooting and shooting on Boban. We could actually get this fight to happen where they could stand up and trade leather, and with heavyweights like that with such power, they would test each other's chin, and probably one of the two would end up going to sleep in this fight. Not sure who. It was a fight that we tried to make for C3. We were just never able to make it happen. I don't fully remember why, but I think something has to do with Mark getting signed by the UFC, and that fight was no longer available for us. Coming at 8 on our list. Now, this fight was talked about so much. It was talked about by the promoters and matchmakers, by the coaches, by the fighters themselves. I was there standing watching these two guys talk to each other about setting this fight up, and it just never happened. Mike Welch versus Jake Narcy. Mike Welch was from Team Cologne, and he racked up a very decorated amateur record, having tons of fights and lots of experience in the cage. With all that experience under his belt, he turned pro as the previous Cutthroat amateur champion, but he only had 2 pro fights, and he called it a career. Very similar to Jake Narcy. Jake Narcy, on the other hand, same thing. Former Cutthroat amateur champion turned pro, and he just went 1-0, and that was it. He hung up the gloves. Life happened. But why this fight never happened is still a mystery to me, and I was very embedded in the matchmaking process and everything behind the scenes Like I said, I was there having conversations with both of these guys, with their coaches, so on and so forth. It didn't happen as amateurs and it didn't happen as pro. I think they just ended up both hanging it up before they could ever actually do it, but it was a fight that everybody wanted to see. Number 7 in the lightweight division. Local favorite Josh Shockley from Winland Valley Tudo, who started fighting professionally when he was only 17 years old and eventually became a UFC veteran, versus Jake Murphy, Illinois State Wrestling Champion, former Purdue wrestler, and he capped his MMA career off at 6-2. Jake Murphy was a very tough wrestler, and as was Josh Shockley. The biggest difference is Jake had those wrestling credentials on paper, Josh did not, but he was a guy who would pick up other wrestlers who had way better paper credentials on his shoulders and slam them down pretty regularly. Josh was super tough. He was one of my favorite fighters to watch, and Jake is somebody that I used to train with, including at Marist High School. I always wondered what that fight would be like, but I could tell you this, even looking back, neither of the two would really be able to give each other much of a break. They would really have to bring it. You can't fight safe in this type of fight because it would really be a battle on wits and who could just outdo the other one. And if you coast it all, if you play it safe, you're going to lose this fight. I really wanted to see Jake's wrestling test Josh Shockley, and at the same time, Shockley's grit and his utter, very high fight IQ, see what he could impose on Jake. It's a fight that I always wanted to see, but same thing, they just never crossed paths, and it's unfortunate. Number 6, Juan Magana versus D-Ray Davis. This fight was talked about in person from both of them. D-Ray even talked to Juan Magana's coach Miguel Torres about this, and I remember being there. I was at the Hammond Civic Center at a Total Fight Challenge event, and he simply told him, I have nothing against Juan, I like the guy a lot, I just feel that he's one of the top welterweights in this area, so am I want to make it happen. And you know what? A fight like that needed to happen, it just never did. D-Ray Davis was the current C3 champion at the time. He was racking up a lot of wins, he was known for very precise striking. Juan Magana, on the other hand, he loved to stand up and bang. He had that tough spirit. He had that style where he'd bite down on his mouthpiece and just keep coming forward. And he had a very decorated submission background as well. The two, if they were to have fought, really would have established a big fight in the local welterweight history, essentially. But they never were able to make it happen. I really think that there was a little bit of political motives on the background on not wanting to fight at certain shows and where would we do this and which promoter are we going to fight for. Unfortunately, the fight just never happened, but it definitely would have been a great one, and I know both guys wanted it. Number 5 on the list, and one that I really, really, really wanted to see, Matt Fierderosa versus Yusuf Saidalive. Two standouts in the area with very decorated wrestling backgrounds, but their jiu-jitsu skills were just as good as their wrestling ability, which was very rare at that time. One thing that stood out to me, and still to this day with Yusuf Saidalive, is he was a Dagestani fighter fighting locally before that whole Dagestani invasion into MMA really even took place. He eventually got a pretty big break when he started fighting for ONE FC. Matt Fierderosa as well had mainstream attention when he was featured on the hit show Tap Out. Now, both of them come with, again, very, very decorated grappling backgrounds, and it would have been a great fight on paper, but also for everybody in the crowd. I really still to this day don't know who I would have picked. I would think that Matt Fierderosa would have the edge on wrestling, but Yusuf would probably have the edge once it gets to the ground as he became a little bit more of a submission artist. But somebody like Matt Fierderosa is extremely durable and hard to finish, and again, his submission game was no slouch either. It's one of those fights where it easily could have propelled either the two into the WEC or the UFC at the time, but it's just a fight that was never really offered. But if this was a main event for an XFO event, that would have been huge. It would have been the perfect event for them two to fight at. Both of them have fought at XFO already, and man, I would say I would be their front row. So excited to watch that, and I know I wouldn't be the only one. Number 4, you want to talk an exciting matchup in the featherweight division? This is one that I always thought would be great, and I think tried to make it happen, just never was able to. Kenny Jordan versus Jose Chepe Mariscal. Kenny Jordan was a Nebraska University wrestler with MMA wins over UFC vets such as Dustin Neese and Bobby Moffitt. Jose, on the other hand, became a UFC veteran and is still currently fighting for the UFC now. Kenny's strengths were his wrestling and his utter grit. What he lacked in knowledge and technical skills and limited jiu-jitsu and dynamic striking, he really made up for just his utter toughness, and he was just so gifted when it comes to being able to push through that wall and just break his opponents with sheer physical force. Chepe, on the other hand, he wrestled as well, not at the level as Kenny Jordan did, but he had such dynamic striking that I would see that he would showcase locally. That is why he's in the UFC today, and he was no slouch on the ground either, and that would have made for an absolute war between the two. You would see Chepe's incredibly high fight IQ versus Kenny Jordan's just bite down on your mouthpiece, do whatever you could do to get the takedown and just stay on top and try to break your opponent mentally. It would be a really, really wild fight, and I really wish I would have been able to successfully make this fight happen. I'm sure, again, I wouldn't be the only one who would want to see that, and it's just one of those that kind of slipped past us that we never got to see. But man, that would be one that we would still be talking about to this day, because hey, I'm talking about it right now and it never even happened. Coming in at number 3 at that list, if you were following C3 back in the day, you would definitely know who Jared McMahon is. Jared the Spider McMahon, fan favorite, one of the most exciting fighters you could ever watch. He had such a high finish rate. I barely remember seeing the guy go to a decision. He submitted almost everybody he fought. So exciting, and the crowd would just roar when he would come out, and he really made the Hammond Civic Center electric. On the other side of the ring or cage, Eddie Winland, former WEC champion, extremely exciting striker with a very good defensive wrestling game that he would put in that would make guys so hard for him to take down. And Eddie would just stand up and stuff all these shots and just go to town with his punches. He had such good footwork, good head movement, and there's a reason why this fight never happened. It was supposed to, it was talked about. Jared McMahon called out Eddie Winland at the Horseshoe Casino at C3 Evolution.
Who do you want? If you could fight any battleweight out there right now in any organization, who do you want? I want Eddie Winland. And it was supposed to happen in April for us, and it's going to happen in April for us for May 9th is when those are going on for us, but he's out there, I know he's out here. I want you, I'm coming to get you, so let's do this.
Eddie Winland wanted it, but then he got the call to return back to the WEC, and when you get a call like that, you cannot turn that down for a local fight. It was supposed to happen, but Eddie got that big call that everyone wants, and he got his return, and he eventually ended up being a part of that merger with the WEC going into the UFC, and he fought on the biggest stage ever, so you can't fault anyone. It was a fight that would have been great locally at the Hammond Civic Center. Everybody would have been there to watch it. It was supposed to happen. It just didn't for a very good reason. But man, that fight, it was the local fight we all wanted. And both of them just brought so many big crowds in, and they were two fan favorites and two great guys. I got to know them both really well. I got to train with them, and it's just one of those that the fans, their training partners, teammates, so on and so forth, everybody would have been in for a treat for that fight. It just never happened. So here we are talking about the what ifs and what it could have been. Coming in at number 2 on this list, it's a fight that I dreamed of having as a main event on a local card when I was matchmaking, especially for UCL. I don't really recall if I ever officially pitched this to anybody, but it sure is one that I talked about wanting to do. Keith Wasnooki, the owner of Winland Valley Tudo and UFC vet, versus Dan the Handler Hornbuckle. Both were very familiar fighting in the area of Northwest Indiana, and we thought it would be a perfect main event at the Hammond Civic Center. Keith Wasnooki, a very crafty and experienced UFC veteran who basically is responsible for breeding some of the toughest fighters that the region's ever had. He was known for grit, for wrestling ability, and an overall very high fight IQ. Dan Hornbuckle, Bellator vet, fought so many big names, fought in Japan, so on and so forth. One of the most exciting welterweights I've ever seen in my life. When Dan Hornbuckle was in the arena, it was just a different aura. Having these two guys meet in the cage together would have been mind-blowing. I don't know to this day who would have won. I could never even make a prediction. I just wanted to see it happen. And me personally, as a guy who's known both of them very well for many years, and just a fan of the sport, fan of making fights, fan of watching fighters grow, fan of taking these UFC vets and then giving them an opportunity to fight again locally in their backyard, it's a fight that would have been so cool for me to see, and I know that place would have been packed. But unfortunately, like I said, at this point, I don't even know if it was ever even officially mentioned to anybody. Keith ended up kind of retiring. It just never happened. But that was always one of my bucket list fights to make, and I just know that, like, if I did, that place would have been packed, and people would still be talking about that fight. And number one on our list, if you know me, you already know what it is. If you've been around the game for a long time, whether you were in XFO territory up in the northwest suburbs, or if you were in the Northwest Indiana MMA region, you probably know what this fight is. But if you haven't guessed it yet, Miguel Torres versus Jeff Curran. Two iconic legends to this day. The amount that both of them have contributed to the sport of mixed martial arts locally, to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu locally, is just through the roof. You couldn't ask for two better ambassadors in their own right on being fighters, to really make it to those big stages, to being coaches, to have so many competition submission grapplers, mixed martial artists that all fought in their footsteps, and they both run very successful gyms. I cannot believe this fight never happened, whether it was pre or post UFC for either of the two, pre or post WEC, nothing. It just never did. Now, I have my own speculations on why it never did, and again, for UCL, we loosely tried it, but it was always one of those things where, and it makes sense, it was money. It was, I want this fight in Hammond. No, I want it in Crystal Lake. And, they both wanted it kind of in their backyards. There wasn't a lot of neutral ground. And when you're able to sell tickets and bring people in, you want to do it nearby you. And it's like, okay, I want the home field advantage. No, I want the home field advantage. And it never really happened. And there were parts in their careers when they were under contracts. So that wasn't the only reason why it never did. But even like the WEC coming to Chicago, they could have headlined it with that, or put it on a UFC undercard or something if it wasn't put on like a local card. But whether they were fresh, new into their career, or if it was towards the end, it still would have been satisfying to see. It doesn't matter if they were 20 years old or 40 years old. It's just one of those fights where, to me, that's like the holy grail matchup in the area that just never happened. And the fact that they're both high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts that are gym owners, that are head coaches, so on and so forth, and it never happened, it's just one of those fights where I'll go on forever saying it's my number one. It's my number one fight that I've always wanted to see, and that will never happen, unfortunately. But if I talk about it this much and it's never happened, I can only imagine how much I would be discussing the fight if it really did. And it's one of those things where it's just unfortunate. It sucks it never happened, but that is by far my number one fight that I always wanted to see, and I know I'm not the only one. Thank you guys for tuning in. This was a special edition. Hope you enjoyed it. Like, share, subscribe.